Welcome to the Future of Sharing, the series where we're trying to figure out how do we make the sharing economy work for everyone. I'm Pete Leiden, I'm the founder of Reinvent, and today we have Sunil Paul, who's one of the co-founders of Sidecar, which was a pioneer in the ride-sharing space, recently sold to General Motors. He's also a serial entrepreneur in a bunch of spaces, particularly though with roots in the sharing economy. And he did a stint as well as a policy analyst at the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment, and kind of has his head into policy matters, which fits nicely with this whole series we're doing here. So welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me here.
Good to have you.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about your roots vis-a-vis the sharing economy, because in really looking back on this, you actually, in the very early days, were in the car sharing space. You're like the early pioneer in this space.
I've been thinking about this a long time. Actually, what's maybe not in my kind of typical bio is way back in 1999, I thought about creating a company around sharing of cars, more in the ride-sharing kind of idea. Decided not to do it back then because I didn't think the technology was not ready, the political will was not there to take on special interests, and I didn't actually think the consumer demand was there yet. So. Fast forward many years later, there's things that happened. The iPhone came out, 9/11 happened, and there's this increase in interest in energy security, and we had advances in electrification of vehicles, and I think there was this greater willingness on the part of policymakers to think about new ways of dealing with transportation. And very importantly, I'd also gained a lot of experience in the sharing world. So I was first an advisor to Sidecar Share, then on their board for several years. Sidecar Share was the largest nonprofit car sharing organization.
Kind of like the Zipcar.
Yeah. They started right around the same time as Zipcar, but just Bay Area. And at Singularity University, I was a founding faculty there, and students of mine there created Get Around, the peer-to-peer car sharing world. So, been thinking about it for a long time. This idea that you can take technology and inject it into the existing way that we think about buying stuff versus the services that we have access to. And I think this big theme, one of the big themes that's going on in the world, is this transition from owning products to access to service. And I think the sharing economy kind of fits into that much, much bigger theme that's going on. So then in 2011, realized there's this big opportunity around leveraging the smartphone, and a lot of these ideas that I've been kicking around, teamed up with co-founders, in particular Jahan Khanna, also some others, and created Sidecar. And the idea behind Sidecar was use technology to allow anyone to become a driver and accept money for that ride. So today we call it ride sharing. We coined that term to apply to this world. I mean, people would use ride sharing, but they typically meant carpooling. And what we found is that ride sharing actually in the California code applied to all kinds of different things. And we were looking for a term to describe this new thing, because Uber already existed, but it was just black cars back then. And we had this radical idea: what if anybody could give you a ride and you could accept money for it? We needed a name for that new idea, and ride sharing was kind of like ambiguous enough, but yet we figured we could own it as a term specific to this new type of thing.
And so you kicked it off, and so it was post.
And actually, the other thing that was going on is that the sharing economy idea was out there, and so Airbnb had started, and it was starting to get traction. Couch surfing was out there and was starting to get traction. This idea of home sharing was already out there, and so it was another reason why we chose ride sharing as the term to describe this kind of new world, new vision of what was possible.
So you embrace the idea of sharing, the sharing economy. In your mind, because this is something that as we talk to people, when you think of what defines the sharing economy from your perspective?
Well, I think the idea of the sharing economy is not new. we've always been able to ask someone else for a ride, ask to stay in someone's house. But what's different is that because of technology, we can scale that up to a massive scale, a worldwide scale. And a big reason for that is that, I think a lot about transaction costs. For me to be able to to find out, oh, Peter could give me a ride, or Peter could put me up for the night, to negotiate with you when and where and under what conditions can I do that, and then to figure out, well, should I buy Peter dinner for that ride? Should I give him gas money? Should I maybe I need to pay him? Like, that's all transaction. In other words, it was such a murky mess. It was hard to figure out that there's someone out there, figure out how much to pay them, figure out kind of the terms of engagement. So information technology allows you, it's a solvent for transaction action. Information technology is like a solvent for transaction costs. Because of your smartphone and GPS location, we can now know where you are when you're driving. Yep. You can indicate the fact that you're willing to give a ride, and I can get matched up with you for that ride. Same thing with home sharing and clothing sharing, and I think this explosion of sharing is because technology allows us to take all those transaction costs, discovery, the conditions of the sale, and the sort of price of the sale or the sharing, all are now possible.
So you see the key is all this lubricating the transaction costs. There is also, though, a trusting strangers in ways that you can, which I guess is related to your scaling point.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's an important piece of the uncertainty of a transaction, because without a reputation system, we don't know, I don't know if I just met you, can I trust you if I stay in your house? Can I trust you to give me a ride? But because of reputation systems, which, before the technology, I'd have to build that reputation because maybe you're a friend of a friend, or because I've stayed with you before, you've given me a ride before, or because I know about other elements of your life that I can kind of establish some trust. But with these information technology-based rating systems, I think first done by eBay, but then spread to lots of other corners of the internet, especially where we were trying to figure out how valid someone's statement is, or eBay is interesting because it was around transactions. Elsewhere, we did it more around whether or not someone was saying something of value. So because of these rating systems, we can establish trust based on kind of the power of the crowd.
And so those two things combined, scalable, boom, it takes off. And so just to kind of finish your story, at least vis-a-vis this, so then your company starts, give us just the basic through line for people that aren't familiar with Sidecar.
Yeah, so I mean, the sort of, the story for Sidecar is we innovated the category. We got traction pretty quickly, but we were facing competitors that already had a bunch more money than us, and very quickly copied us and then raised more money. So it's kind of the unfortunate breaks of the game sometimes that. So we ended up innovating things like instant ride sharing, sharing your ETA, providing drivers directions, the pooling or lift line kind of idea. All those were things that we released at least first among the three companies, and sometimes the first ever. But it simply was not enough to overcome this huge money advantage that the others had. It's a very capital intensive to get these marketplaces up and off the ground. So we decided we need to sell, and and General Motors bought the assets of the company really because they saw the opportunity in the capacity of the people, the technology, and some of the IP that we had.
So, although you innovated in those spaces, they weren't patentable or anything, so they're copyable at some level. Some of those things, and so
We actually do have some patents.
Oh, you have some. That's interesting. Well, so in some respects, although that's why you're one of the perfect people to talk to in this conversation, because you get the space, but you don't have as
I'm
much.
not encumbered.
You're
I'm not trying to like pitch, don't download Sidecar.
Exactly. So you can, and again, with your background, I think in policy and thinking about that, there's an interesting piece of that. Now, there is one thing in the history I just want to point out there is that you also, in 2010, was it, you were behind California's, a law that actually had to do with this category? Talk about that, because that's interesting, because I'm trying to figure out how to start doing these things more.
Well, I think there's a lot of lessons out of that, but the short story is that as I started looking at peer-to-peer car sharing, not ride sharing, car sharing, I realized that there's a risk that the owner of a car takes if they loan it out to someone else and make any kind of money off of it. So if I loan you my car and you get in a wreck, as long as there's no commercial transaction, personal insurance historically covered that. But almost all of the personal insurance lines, all those personal insurance companies would say, well, if Peter paid you for that use of that car, then not only is that accident not covered, but my own personal insurance could be canceled. So we went to the legislature and said, hey, look, we're interested in this category of peer-to-peer car sharing, but someone's personal insurance could be canceled. So we're successful in getting a law that basically said, as long as you're not making more than the total cost of the car over the course of a year, your personal insurance can't be canceled. And that law, I think, worked in the beginning. So one of the interesting lessons is, okay, there's willingness, there's political will to support innovations in transportation.
Okay.
But I think there are several negative examples out of it, in that while that template started being copied in other geographies, I know from talking to some of the other car sharing companies that while the environmentalists often wanted to go have it copied in other cities and other states, eventually the other companies said, you know what, let's stop, because we found a workaround for this issue. It doesn't seem to be as big an issue as we thought, and every time it goes to another state house, the lobbyists, especially the special interests out of the insurance companies, which all have tremendous power at the state houses, they keep larding it up with more and more conditions. And it makes it harder and harder for us to have to deal with all these different conditions in all these different states. We'd rather just have universal policy, basically insurance policies of their own, that would cover the circumstance of when someone else is using your car. Now, that seems to have worked in most locations, but then we also know that in some geographies, like New York, relay rides, Turo, and I think Get Around also ran into problems with basically a very related set of issues that they weren't able to kind of overcome. And I'm sure it's because of the power of the insurance companies in the state houses.
Okay, so let's the lessons learned here is really important, because for what we're trying to figure out.
If I had to do it over again, I would not go to the state house first.
Really?
And frankly, that was a lesson learned that I applied to Sidecar.
Really?
We didn't go to the state house. We were like, look, we designed the system in a way that, thank God in the United States there is a principle that says if it's not explicitly disallowed, you can go do it. Now, interestingly, in Japan and in Germany, it's not that way, and several other jurisdictions, I think maybe France, where you have to have explicit permission, or at least that's the perception, a wide perception in the business community. So that kind of principle in the United States is really important, because yes, there are rules that say here's how you have to treat whether or not you're making money off a car, and whether or not it's livery, and what kinds of licenses you have to have. But we basically designed the original version of Sidecar in a way that it was able to I'll call it exploit gray areas in the existing regulation. And so we didn't have to go get permission. It results in a huge groundswell of demand for the service. And the fact that our competitors copied it helped kind of spread it even further. And the Public Utilities Commission basically looked at it and said, well, okay, look, there's a ton of people using this. They all love it. They all kind of hate the incumbent taxi services. So let's figure out a way to accommodate it. I think it's very important, though, that you had a set of regulators that were willing to work with the innovation. We ran into other jurisdictions that they weren't willing to entertain these new innovations, and were frankly in the pocket of the taxi industry and the.
Were these city level or state level?
Well, it's both. So it depends on the jurisdiction. Sometimes it's regulated at the city level, sometimes at the state level, sometimes it's a weird combination of both. Philadelphia has this weirdo setup where the city taxis are regulated by the state.
Okay.
There's a history, but whatever. The point is that in most cities, the city regulates taxis, and usually the state regulates the limos. And now they tend to also regulate this new ride-sharing category as well.
So one of the things you said early on in the conversation, but also again here, is that there was in certain places this willingness to evolve policy, but at the same time you're saying that by no means was universal, and so it's a little bit of a crapshoot at who's open and who isn't. Is that one way?
Yeah, and it's and you can't always predict it. So in a place like Austin, where you'd expect, oh wow, lots of innovation, lots of support for environmental innovation, was one of the jurisdictions that was most aggressive in impounding cars and basically forcing us to leave.
So you were part of that too?
Well, there's two different stories around that. When we first launched, we were the only ones, and Austin came down on us very, very heavily. Then many years later, I think it was 2 years later, thus many in the world of startups.
Exactly.
More than one is many. Yeah, right. So anyway, significant time later, Lyft and Uber launched, also ran into problems, but then did a ballot initiative, and they basically were able to apply a lot more money and a lot more effort to getting to a successful outcome there.
One of them they got rejected, right?
The ballot initiative.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the ballot initiative, and then
they
I actually lost the thread on what happened after that.
Yeah. But it is but this is exactly, so this is what's happening. So in the meta way, let's just step back here a second. In the meta way, you've got this innovative new thing based on these new tools with these new possibilities, lowering transaction costs, trust, scalability. Totally makes sense from a tech point. Then it comes into the real world of like, whoa, okay, there's these existing regulations, but then you say it's interesting in American situation you can actually get cracks between that where you continue to do more innovation. But at some point, to scale it, you got to get into the fabric of
that's right.
the policy of this of whatever.
And we always knew that category was going to be regulated. Like there's a consistent history of the innovators figure out ways to operate that are not in a way that's not currently regulated, right? Because you can't go straight into the teeth of something that's illegal. Right. You're just going to get flat out shut down. Right. Although actually sometimes that does kind of work, but most of the time you have to figure out a way that is at least gray area, if not fully in kind of clearly legal. And count on a groundswell of demand to carry your way. Now, I would say you really want to focus on rules that are set at the local and state level and not federal, because you basically have some recourse. If you're dealing with the FAA, the FDA, anything federal level, anything with a kind of F in it or the SEC, once they rule, that's done, right? You're done with the United States. Mm-hmm. And if they rule against you, or they rule for you, you're in good shape. You're only, if they rule against you, maybe you can go try to set up shop somewhere else, some other country, mm-hmm. but you don't have a lot of recourse, and it's a big opportunity, and there's lots of reasons why you want to be in the U.S. If the state of California or the city of San Francisco or San Jose or whoever rule against you, well, you've got lots of other options. And there are going to be other states and other cities that will see it, will understand the innovation, are willing, have a big enough problem with the incumbents mm-hmm. that they're going to be willing to try the new thing. Mm-hmm. So I think, for innovators out there that are thinking about how do I apply these lessons to my own sharing economy idea or my own, I don't know, whatever the new idea is. I mean, look, the history of technology is we're always figuring out mm-hmm. new things, and by the definition of those new things, the current laws and regulations don't, often don't account for them. Mm-hmm. So, you got to think about how to deploy in a way that you can actually get enough of a groundswell. Sorry, I'm not being clear here. No, in the beginning, you're going to be operating, you may be operating in gray area, but it's more or less inevitable that there's going to be some level of regulation, even if that regulation just simply says you're not going to be regulated. Mm-hmm. So a good example is the the Telecom Act of '96, which made it clear that content providers mm-hmm. on the internet, on this new, back then it wasn't just the internet, it was also mm-hmm. AOL and CompuServe and Prodigy, that those service providers were not responsible for the content that was being created by users. And that important principle is a kind of regulation, but it was a regulation that basically said you're not going to regulate these folks, that they're going to be clear of liability, that if someone posts in your forum, mm-hmm. I mean, these rules still apply today, and they're important because it basically means that if you host a blog or you host a whatever, someone comments on your Facebook mm-hmm. story, your Snapchat story, or whatever, that you're not liable if they defame someone else or basically some criminal act they take on is their responsibility, not your responsibility.
So one principle out of that, then, interesting enough, if a rule of thumb there is to try to, you like the idea of staying local and versatile so that you can actually you can evolve and take step backs and move to other fronts.
Yeah.
Would you go even further and say always try to start at the lowest level, maybe, of city as opposed to state?
Well,
state as opposed
it's a little bit of a balance
to
because you'd rather have the smallest number of regulations you can deal with. So, you'd much rather have a federal rule that says, look, here's clarity for the entire country, but you have this problem that if they rule against you, like drones are a good example, right? It's been pretty difficult to get commercial drone licenses in the U.S. Other countries have been more willing, and so now you see deployments in other countries rather than here. So, and I think eventually we'll get that sorted out, but in the meantime, all the tests are happening in other countries, or not. Many of the tests are happening in other countries. So you'd rather have consistent rules across the entire country, but you kind of want that flexibility. So I frankly think the state level is the best when entrepreneurs are thinking about this, because you have the flexibility of moving from state to state. Get at least 50 options, but you don't have the massive fragmentation of rules that if you have to go city by city by city.
So it's it's interesting balancing out there. And if you were giving advice to not just because you're kind of talking there from the point of view of the entrepreneur, if you're talking from the point of view of the policymaker.
I think it's similar. Like policymakers, I mean, their agenda should be looking out for the public interest, obviously, number one. But part of that is encouraging innovation, because part of the public interest is having greater innovation. I mean, you look at many of the things that we have and that we love in our modern life are the result of innovations. And certainly here in California, but in I think pretty much every geography now wants a little bit of that Silicon Valley magic, and that comes down to innovation. So you got to have rules that are supportive of innovation because that is in the public good, in the public interest. But I think there are other constraints, and I think the key for a policymaker is don't be hoodwinked by the special interests using public safety or other, I'll call them kind of easy things to latch onto as an excuse to kind of kill the innovation baby. Public safety, of course, it's in the public interest to have public safety, but there is more than one way. I mean, the example in ride sharing is, there's legislators calling for fingerprints for everybody who's a rideshare driver. In my view, totally ridiculous requirement. Why? Because the innovation around ride sharing, first of all, we know that ride sharing is way more safe than taxis, way more safe for lots of reasons. The idea and the fundamental innovation in ride sharing is that I can go for an hour and go out and give rides this week, and next week I can do 20, and the next week I can do 0, and then maybe that's it. Or maybe because I was just trying to fill a little bit of income between like my 2 jobs. That kind of flexibility is unparalleled in the traditional economy. Mm-hmm. And so we've created this innovation. If you had to go in and get your fingerprint, there's no way I'm going to go get my fingerprints and then go work 21 hours because, whatever, I lost one job before I get my next job. No way. Mm-hmm. But yet, we've created this system. It's incredibly safe, and compared to, taxi driving, both for the driver and for the rider. But yet, you're still seeing demands out there for fingerprint scanning, because fears of public safety and all that. It's basically a lot of BS being put forward by the incumbent industries.
Just for someone who's maybe is not familiar with how the system works, why is it safer? Just give the kind of
so why is it safer? Because there's rating systems. Because there's tracking of I got into this car with this driver, and because there's background checks that are done electronically. You couldn't do that 8 years ago. Mm-hmm. But today you can do instant background checks on people with actually not all that much information. So all of those things together, and there's other things too, like people can track your ride, you can send your ride information to a friend. Mm-hmm. Like the whole system is set up in a way that it's not impossible. Lots of bad things happen, but lots of bad things happen when you're just driving your car and in taxis and other types of transportation. Mm-hmm. But I think we'll see that the instances, now that we've got a lot more data, I haven't seen recent data on this, but I know from what we were experiencing at Sidecar and also the kind of feedback we got from both riders and drivers, mm-hmm. was that they felt way safer in Sidecar than in taxi.
I totally agree. I just wanted to kind of lay that
from
point of view. So when you say special interest, you really kind of mean the incumbent industry that you're disrupting, right?
Yes.
So is there any kind of strategies from the entrepreneur's point of view or even from the policymaker's point of view to deal with those folks more constructively, or is it just basically a head-on butting heads, someone's going to win, someone's going to lose thing, or is there a way to kind of accommodate any issues there?
I mean, I think it really depends on the sector.
Yeah.
Every one of them is going to be a little different. I think there's, generally speaking kind of from an entrepreneurial perspective, there's kind of 3 paths. One path is start so small and so silly that you'll be ignored, which is more or less the strategy that peer-to-peer car sharing in the beginning was small and silly. Mm-hmm. We know that, for example, a lobbyist for I don't remember if it was Hertz or Avis, or it was one of the large car rental companies, asked to, inquired about kind of what's going on with this bill, and when they found out about it, they're like, oh, who cares? Now, of course, that industry now is something that absolutely threatens Avis and Hertz. But it started out small and silly, and so it was basically ignored. So that's an okay strategy, but obviously only for something that is kind of relatively small scale, but has the promise of being bigger. The second is co-opt the interests of the incumbents. So certainly we've seen that in the ride-sharing world where technology companies have gone in and provided technology to the taxi companies and to the limo companies so that they can offer similar kind of technology. I think there's, in the insurance case, we were able to present to the insurance industry that there's opportunity in peer-to-peer ride sharing, being able to offer new kinds of insurance products, being able to get data out of the cars so that they can have more robust data profiling of how accidents happen and all that kind of stuff. And so, we're able to, co-opt is kind of an aggressive term, but have a more cooperative way of kind of solving their problems while simultaneously solving your own problem. And then the third is just head on. I mean, sometimes there's just no substitute for, look, we're a better way, they're the old way, and they're destructive to the public good, even while claiming that they're trying to build it. And you need to help us and not them. And yes, their business is going to decline. And that's just the way it is because we're a better solution. And it depends on where you are in the growth of the company and what kind of company we're talking about. And this is not the sharing economy. We're talking about innovation. Like every innovator that's doing something interesting has to deal with this. Because if you're not butting up against some level of regulation at some point in your company's trajectory, then you're probably not doing that much interesting stuff.
Interesting. So we've been talking a lot about, we're drawing generic lessons for the sharing economy, but we've been talking mostly with ride sharing here. You've made an interesting distinction that I want you to lay out that kind of plays into the different sectors of the sharing economy. You've made a distinction between capital maximizing or kind of taking underutilized capital, sharing economy kind of approaches, and then also underutilized labor. You kind of talk about it in terms of business models, but also I just want to distinguish those two. So can you explain a little bit to how you think about that, basically? I'm thinking that down at one point, labor utilization and capital utilization between car sharing and ride sharing, for example, as an example, is the way you split.
Yeah, well...
Is that, we're trying to understand, do you think of those as two different sectors of essentially the sharing economy in terms of what we're sharing?
I don't really think about it as two different sectors. At least in the ride sharing world, they are heavily commingled. Right? There's labor utilization and capital utilization. I mean, what do we mean by that? Labor utilization, I think from a macro standpoint, what's going on with labor? Like, we're just seeing that jobs are less and less secure. And so the big innovation, the big opportunity for innovators is to, I don't think jobs are going to become massively more secure. I think we need to, there's a whole, by the way, I think the fact that we have more of a social safety net is one of the things that's has enabled the sharing economy. Without great health care, without having a full-time job, without other things that we've had for a long time, like Social Security and access to other kinds of retirement programs, which we need to augment. Without that kind of social safety net, it's much, much harder to deploy a sharing economy kind of company. Another big one has frankly been the extension of healthcare to, I think, up to 26-year-olds under their parents' plan. All those things have helped a lot. But the fundamental problem we've got with labor utilization and efficiency is that jobs are less secure. And so being able to create other kinds of income opportunities for people so that and the key with labor utilization for one of these companies is making sure that when you're engaged, you're making money. Because
You're meaning the company, or you meaning?
I mean the individual.
Yeah. Okay.
And that comes down to the fundamental thing that a company needs to do is create liquidity, create matches between, whoever's got the availability of either labor or a capital asset and the demand for it, and that liquidity is super important. From a capital utilization, capital efficiency standpoint, you really need to be able to have expensive capital assets, and homes and cars are the two most expensive things that anyone buys. You got to make sure that those things are effectively utilized. Historically, people don't utilize their car very much. And I think the big innovation that we're seeing in both these sectors is different ways for people to be able to heavily utilize your car and make money off of it. And the same thing with your house. You don't use most of the square footage of most homes. To be able to kind of capitalize it or utilize that capital is it's important. You actually might be talking about an observation I made. I can't remember where, but somewhere I made an observation that one of the challenges with car sharing is that you need to be able to utilize the vehicle heavily in order to kind of make it pencil if you own the asset. That's kind of an arcane point.
But it's an important one for this. I just want to make it clear here. Again, these are conversations we're going quite deep into the details, but it's because it's important for people trying to wrap their heads around this, from running cities and policymakers and things like that, is what makes it a sharing economy experience rather than just a pure gig economy thing is that they're actually not just sharing their labor, but they're sharing their asset of the car, right? Would you put it that way? So yes, they're driving their own car. So yes, you're getting their labor, but you're also really getting the car,
right?
In a way that, whereas they're, Airbnb or sharing a house is pretty straightforward. You're sharing that capital, but maybe a little labor on cleaning it up or something.
Right.
But the other one also has a sharing component. It's not just labor sharing; it's a thing that you're
sharing.
Yeah. So.
Absolutely.
But I guess what I'm trying to understand is, do you see those as different ways that have to be regulated differently? And we're trying to understand, is there a differentiation between the approaches to, let's say, fundamentally reworking policy around home sharing as opposed to ride sharing? I mean, is it because one's using more labor and one's using more capital? I mean, I'm just trying to get some understanding of how you think about applying new policy thinking into the different sectors or something, or subdivisions of the sharing economy.
Yeah.
Any thoughts there?
I mean, nothing other than sort of general. We have a different set of rules already for how we manage and regulate capital assets compared to how we manage labor. And I think both those sets of rules are heavily we need to change both of them to be able to handle what's possible because of new technology.
Mm-hmm. Would you think in terms of so for example, if you're in the home sharing space, when we talk to people about that, the incumbents there are like hotels. There's also issues around neighbors, disruption of neighborhood and the character of neighborhoods. There is safety, but in a different way, like what happens if a fire goes on or something. So and then the ride sharing, you've touched on a lot of the key pieces there. And the question is, I guess we're just trying to understand commonalities and distinctions between those two. But I guess what you're saying is they really are pretty distinct, and you just got to kind of go deep in whatever space you're in. So in other words, home sharing has its own set, and
I think there's
no like sharing kind of Uber way to think of policy in the sharing economy.
I mean,
Uber in the
I understand. I think the commonality is policymakers need to recognize that new technology allows you to kind of slice and dice your capital asset and turn it into a service for other people. Like that and again, it's been possible for a long time. Going back to the example of me loaning your or borrowing your car or staying in your house, but this technology allows you to do it in a much more scalable, much more robust, more reliable, safer way than was ever possible in the past. It also is allowing us to do the same thing with labor. In other words, that kind of slicing and dicing of your time, in the past, it made way more sense to go, when I say past, like really this trend has been going on for quite some time. It's almost entirely enabled because of information technology. Mm-hmm. But say 30 years ago, it made way more sense for you to work inside a company, to have a manager. That manager told you what to do over a period of weeks and months and years. And the direction from that manager was pretty much the way that you figured out what are your priorities and how much you're going to get paid. This new set of technologies, just like it allows us to slice and dice your capital asset and turn it into a service. Over on the labor side, it allows you to slice and dice your time. I mean, it's still service, doesn't turn into a product or anything, but into a physical product. But you can be a Lyft driver in the morning and have your room out for rent and go on to a job site that used to be called Odesk. I've forgotten the new name of it, and have a job that is remote architecture design, and live a life that puts all those pieces together and has income from different sources, mm-hmm. and have a lot of flexibility in your life. Mm-hmm. And that's the big gain that people get out of that world. But that slicing and dicing of being able to get a contract on your architecture job and also be able to go give rides on Lyft, that's only possible because of these new technologies. So when we think about it from a policy standpoint, yep. There are a bunch of rules that we developed the thinking about them really in an era when a person had one job. And we were talking about social safety net earlier. A big reason why we need a more robust healthcare program that isn't attached to your job is because people change jobs much more often. And a big reason why they change jobs more often, not forget about like the sharing economy kind of jobs. I'm just talking about the fact that it's now acceptable that you go, you have a job for a year or two or three, and then you go to another job. Mm-hmm. That didn't used to be the case. Mm-hmm. Why is that? Because it's much easier to have transferable skills because, in large part because of information technology and the way that we structure organizations, the ability to define jobs much more carefully, like all of that allows for greater mobility mm-hmm. on the part of someone who's got a job.
Do you feel we're at a point though, because we've seen enough traction with the sharing economy, we've seen enough disruption around that, do you feel we're at some kind of critical moment in terms of either getting these policies right in the next period of time here, or we could kind of thwart whether this is going, or kind of stifle it, or do you think where do you think we are in this process of reinventing essentially the policies around this part of the economy?
My sense is that we're past the point of whether or not these services are going to exist. We're now at the level of how do we intelligently and productively regulate them. Again, regulation not necessarily meaning here are all the rules you have to follow, but regulation can also be, okay, we're going to just make it clear that you don't have to follow, like you're clear of these existing rules, taxi rules or hotel rules or whatever. And in the case, going back to CompuServe and AOL, that Telecom Act of 96 basically said you're not living by the same rules as the newspapers. And you're also not living by the rules of the telephone company. Those were the two models that we had. Mm-hmm. And the world that we live in today, filled with all kinds of innovation of Facebook and Twitter and blogs and everything else, is all built on that foundation of the 96 Telecom Act that said, no, you're not a newspaper, and no, you're not the telephone company. Mm-hmm. You're this new thing. And so I think in the same way, and again, it's all innovation. It's a new thing. Like car sharing is a new thing. Ride sharing is a new thing. Home sharing is a new thing. To say, oh, you're actually a rental car company. Oh, no, you're actually a taxi or a limo. Oh, no, you're actually a hotel is nonsense. And you need to create a new set of rules. So, 20 years from now, will there be car sharing, ride sharing, and home sharing? Absolutely. Like the horse is out of the barn that you're not going to put it back. But can we have a consistent set of rules across lots of geographies? It'd be great to have federal level rules for these services that kind of look at kind of homogenize and standardize across at least states, but ideally at the national level. I think those are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about now, is how do we standardize so that we can continue to have innovation. Because I also believe that this level of innovation is going to enable yet other layers of innovation on top of it.
Meaning off of ride sharing, you could also delivery.
Delivery is a good example. Once ride sharing companies, Sidecar, Lyft, and Lyft hasn't done this yet, but Sidecar and Uber, once we had our kind of core layer of capability, drivers and cars and the dispatching infrastructure and all that, we turned around and also started offering delivery, the ability to move goods as well. And that's one that was captive to the company. But the fact that delivery service is available is now enabling other kinds of services to live on top of it. I eat a paleo diet, and there's a paleo dedicated delivery service in San Francisco that would never exist 5 years ago, because they were doing their deliveries through Sidecar, and now they do their deliveries through Uber. It's called Meal Made. And if you eat paleo, it's a great way to go. But a dedicated paleo restaurant, like even with San Francisco's, great diversity of different kinds of food, it's a bit of a stretch. But, they're making a go of it because they can aggregate demand across the entire city because they've got this delivery network. So just one small example, one company, but there's going to be other kinds of services that are enabled on top of basically using these services as infrastructure for something else.
And do you think, in a broader thing, do you think we're going to go more and more into sharing different aspects? I mean, we've been primarily talking about cars, homes, now it's starting to get to delivery.
Technologically,
do you think we'll be sharing tools?
So technologically, there's no reason why we couldn't, allow us to share pens in an office. But at some point, the value of the product is so low that it doesn't kind of make sense for the overhead of sharing. I remember I used to say, everything will be shareable. And it is true, everything will be shareable, but you won't necessarily want to share it. There won't necessarily be the motivation or the you're not going to want to share everything, but in theory you could.
But is it maybe one way to think about it is in terms of the pricing, high capital cost things, anything of a certain level and down, it'll hit a point where you say, like, no one's going to share this thing.
Right.
But lawnmowers on the block of the neighborhood, or a chainsaw, or kids' bikes, or something. I don't know. Do you feel like every category is going to kind of get hit at some level in the sharing vibe, or is it, or that's kind of just, again, maybe too?
I think as the cost of the capital good comes down, or I think some of these capital goods are getting more and more expensive, and so it makes sense to share. When I used to say this about 4 years ago, I'd say things like, everything's going to be shareable. And someone said, yes, Sunil, I'm not sharing my toothbrush with you anytime soon. It's funny. It was like, all right, who would share a toothbrush? That makes no sense. But what's happened in the meantime is we've had an increase in sophistication of toothbrushes. So toothbrushes now cost, like these powered ones, what, they cost like $100, and it only makes sense to you share it, but the part that's kind of personalized to you, that goes in your mouth, is the one that you put on and off. And so I think there's also going to be kind of some of these capital goods are going to become more shareable by their very nature. I don't know if a pen applies
Yeah,
or
no, the
not.
pen might not do it. Maybe even that. I still might not share my toothbrush with you, regardless. But
No, it's the top.
yeah,
You don't know what I'm
I
talking
get
about.
it,
So
I
there's
get
like
it,
you
I
know,
get it.
like I have my top, it goes onto the thing, and you have your top.
So what's implied in this, in the backdrop here, is even another argument for a policymaker towards that these are more sustainable ways to do it. And I'm just curious if you had, if you think about that as a big selling point of, because on one level you say, well, the sharing economy is here to say, okay, I got to deal with it. That's one way to kind of argue it. And
So
you
I have
say
a-
people want it, but on the other hand, if you're really a policymaker, what's the positive sell? Is there a positive sell on, hey, this is the future of sustainability, or we got to share more in our cities, or?
So I have a complex answers to that.
Okay.
I do not think it's simple to say this is sustainable. I will say I used to. I spent a lot of time looking at sustainable practices. I think we had 100 people involved in this study that looked at, it's called the Gigaton Throwdown study, where we looked at what are the different pathways to be able to scale solutions to climate. And it was one of the motivations to start Sidecar, as I believed it would be more sustainable. Now I don't know. Why? Because as we've made things more efficient, as we made it more convenient and cheaper to have access to a ride, have access to a place to stay, it tends to increase the use of it. So now we've got people using it more. People who lived in the Mission neighborhood of San Francisco now have access to the entire city, and they take advantage of it. Whereas in the past, parking was terrible and transit was terrible, and so living in the Mission wasn't nearly as desirable. It's hard to get elsewhere into the city. So people use it more. The second is that once the capability is out there and it's convenient and it's cheap, then all these other services get built on top, right? MealMade would not exist without this infrastructure. And so now we're using it even more. So from a pure efficiency and convenience standpoint, it's good, but it's not, even if we result in lower utilization of resources, in the narrow case, there's a significant bounce back effect, also known as Jevons paradox, that will cause at least as much, if not more, in the general case. Now, I don't think that's always true. There are examples of efficiency that I don't think will increase utilization of things. Now, getting into the one that I thought of is, the urinals that don't use water, like that's not going to result in more urinals going to be installed everywhere, But in cases like this, it's something that's kind of widely used, and there's really kind of a large demand for convenient transportation, a large demand for housing that's convenient and affordable. You're going to get more utilization. People will take more trips to be able to take advantage of the cheap, affordable, or maybe unique accommodations. People will take more trips out of the Mission. People will build new services on top of the existing set of services. Now, that would all say, never mind, don't bother with efficiency. But lately I've been thinking, so I am a deep skeptic of efficiency as a solution to climate. Now, can it be economical? Yes, absolutely. Can it be good for the people who are using it? Absolutely, absolutely. But to say that it's a good solution to climate, I actually think is generally not a good idea. Now, and by the way, I think that applies to building efficiency, all kinds of things, because we basically make it more affordable. We didn't used to have buildings with high ceilings as kind of everyday use, but a big reason why we can is because we are so efficient at heating and cooling buildings now. All of that said, there is a pathway that ride sharing in particular could result in a significant impact on climate. I haven't fully developed this, but the pathway that it could is that because we have ubiquitous ride sharing and we add electrified autonomous cars into those networks, it's conceivable that that could accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles. You have to, using electrified vehicles to have a big impact on climate is very, very tough because The average life of a car is 16 years, so there's a long turnover in the established fleet. Yeah, we're not going to get to 100% electrified vehicles anytime soon, in kind of the status quo method of you have to buy a car. So, but if there was a kind of new model for having access to transportation that's not about buying a vehicle, but instead having access to a network of services that are all supplied by electrified autonomous vehicles, then perhaps we could accelerate the deployment of electric vehicles way faster than if we had to own them. And that could have an impact on climate, not over in Gigaton Throwdown, we're trying to think about how could we do it in just 10 years? How could we have a big impact in just 10 years? It'll take a longer time to have an impact on climate, more on the order of 30, 40, 50 years, but it could, maybe it could have an impact. So I'm basically in the camp of maybe for ride sharing, but it really depends. But currently, no, I don't think it's helping in a sustainable way. And frankly, definitely no for the other categories, because I think the bounce back of building efficiency and home sharing and all these others will at least, over a time frame that matters for climate, right? Climate doesn't care about the next 4 or 5 years. Climate cares about the next several decades. But our actions matter, and the decisions that we make matter, because a lot of those decisions put in place things that will be around for the next several decades. So over the course of sort of a climate impact, things like building efficiency and ride sharing efficiency and home sharing efficiency are not going to matter, because people will adapt their behavior to kind of take advantage of that new efficiency.
That's interesting. So just a commonsensical way of thinking about that would be, hey, instead of building a new hotel, you're taking a home that's underutilized and you're just cycling more people through it. You're saying, from a climate point of view, even though you're avoiding kind of another building and the whole kind of thing, you're saying it's just stimulating someone to fly in and take that space.
That's right. Especially when it's affordable.
All secondary kind of things that are spinning off of that. That's interesting.
Especially when it's affordable, convenient, and unique. Especially for home sharing, it's kind of a unique, interesting experience. And so I think it stimulates more tourism, more travel. And frankly, I'm sure the home sharing people don't like to hear this, but frankly, it incentivizes a lot of air travel, which is incredibly, from a climate standpoint, you just generate, most affluent people, their biggest carbon footprints, their air travel. So extra jet flights really rack up the carbon footprint. In the grand kind of world scheme of things, jet travel's not that much, but I don't think efficiency is a legitimate claim to climate sustainability. It could have claims to other kinds of sustainability.
Well, this last one is just kind of a lighter way to think of it. What about people who think about the sharing economy? Again, this is more of a general argument of like, why would we care about this? Why do we move forward? What's the reason to kind of go through all this innovation to figure this stuff out? Do you think it actually is connecting people differently and building some kind of interpersonal connections in a way that you don't when you're just in a more kind of the previous kind of world? I'm curious how you think about it.
This is one of the most wonderful things about ride sharing and the Sidecar experience is just the connections with people. And I feel like our world is being, our social fabric is being destroyed by a lot of these new technologies. In particular, I think social media is, even despite its name, is kind of anti-social media. It discourages face-to-face communication, and somehow, the data is that after you spend time on social media, you feel worse than before. But we've got these new services, these sharing services, where you're engaging with people, where you're able to have, stay in someone's home and have them show you their town, or, drivers that are taking you to wherever, to the airport, around town, that, they're not jaded I've been working 15 hours today, I don't want to talk to anybody people. They're like, hey, I'm out here giving a few rides and happy to have a talk with you. And like that kind of social interaction it's magic. And it is, I think, was an unexpected surprise. One of the great joys of Sidecar and ride sharing, running the company, but also just experiencing it myself is, yeah, you get to meet people and talk to them. And you know, if you want to sit and chill and not talk to anybody, you do that too. But because sometimes I just don't want to talk to anybody. I just want to, you know, stay or do my thing. But there's all this other stuff going on that's I think enriching our lives and connecting us to people in our community. And I'm proud of that part of what we created with ride sharing.
I think it's given the day-to-day, which we're taking in the aftermath of the election, more connection, more understanding, and more of that is good. Let's have
more connection is good. Yes, we all need it.
We all need that, and I think it's an interesting moment to reflect on that. But anyhow, it's a good way to end the interview. Thanks a ton for
Yeah, thank you.
And as usual, we've actually had a really deep and interesting conversation that sheds more light on this as we plug ahead to figure out how can we make that sharing economy work for everybody.